Season 8 was one of the most controversial seasons during all of League of Legends, and a lot of people did end up quitting the game, although there was also some high points. The season started off in a really weird spot during the preseason when AD carries would start building Relic Shield and start just surviving the lane pretty much no matter what. AD carries that normally had a really rough lane phase like Vayne would just go for a Relic Shield because they could execute minions rather easily, get some really nice lane sustain, and bonus gold for their support champion. If their support champion also went for a Relic Shield, there'd be bonus gold and bonus health going all around the lane, and it was really hard to punish any of those champions. This made the AD carries lane phase during the preseason very boring because there was not a lot of action because there was so much sustain going throughout the lane and everybody was safe. Of course, Riot did realize how ridiculous this was and it was nerfed, but for this point in time, it was insanely boring during the lane phase, but hey, at least AD carries were playable. Although this was a really low point in that bottom lane for League of Legends, at least AD carries couldn't get any worse, right? Well, no, wrong. Partway through the season, the notorious patch 8.11 came out, which was known as how AD carries were ruined. The price of crit items increased, items like Lord Dominic's Regards had the armor penetration reduced, and Infinity Edge was gutted. An item that used to increase your critical strike damage by 50% instead got a little bit of its damage converted into true damage, which made the damage difference pretty significant. The base stats of a lot of AD carries was nerfed, and shielding champions even got gutted in the patch following this. When you add all this together, AD carries were weaker in the early game, they hit their power spikes later, and that power spike wasn't even as big as it was before. If all of that wasn't enough, the shielding support champions that used to be really strong helping them were also nerfed as well, so they became even weaker than they already were. This caused a lot of outrage in the community, especially against those AD carry mains, and we'd see stuff like this on Twitter.
Yo, I have a question about the Aatrox rework. Can you guys please revert crit items? I can't play the fucking game anymore! I'm begging you!
Although perhaps a little over the top, Tyler is not wrong, AD carries were in a very bad spot. They were in such a bad spot that people started playing mages in the bottom lane instead, things like Heimerdinger, Brand, and Swain. Since AD carries were so weak, there was absolutely no point to playing them in the bottom lane, so you may as well play something else instead. If mages weren't your thing though, you could always play a bruiser in the bottom lane as well, something like an Aatrox, Aurelia, or a Yasuo. These champions did as much damage as AD carries, if not more, but were a hell of a lot tankier. Some AD carries did manage to stay in the meta, things like Lucian that were rather mobile, but for the most part, AD carries were gone. It is worth mentioning that Riot did create the Stormrazor as an item as well during this time period, which was pretty strong, and it is great in the early game, but still, you were nowhere near as strong in the late game. One downside to this strategy, however, was the fact that taking towers was a little bit harder, but that brought in another meta, the Banner of Command. One of the downsides of not having a long-range AD champion would be the fact that it's harder to take down towers. To deal with this problem, tankier champions like a Scion will build a Banner of Command, buff a minion, and wait for them to take the tower instead. The Banner of Command meta was a really long time ago, so this of course is not a Banner of Command replay, but champions like Scion would be the ones you would most often see taking this item. This item, just like the Relic Shield, made for some pretty boring gameplay because you'd just be buffing your minions and waiting for them to take down the towers. You didn't really have to siege into them when you did have a Banner of Command. You'd just have to play very patiently when sieging towers and wait for the minions to do the work instead. When Banner of Command was put on a minion, it would become a lot stronger, gain some really nice health, and it was immune to spells. If the enemy had something like an Anivia that was trying to counter-push the lanes while you were sieging, they would no longer be damaged by Anivia's ultimate, and getting that tower was actually possible. The item was eventually removed because it made for some really boring gameplay, and I think it was an attempt to get AD carries back into the meta, but still they weren't that strong at this point in time, and you didn't need to take one just to take down towers. Although this meta wasn't very fun to watch either, it got even worse. The next thing we had to suffer through during Season 8 was the hypercarry gold funnels. Since AD carries weren't really at a stage where they could hypercarry anymore, some strategies were drafted where a Karthus, Master Yi, or sometimes even a Kai'Sa were funneled the majority of gold. This is because champions like this can solo carry games, but they do need a lot of items, so if you can get them a lot of gold and as many items as quickly as possible, they will be able to carry the game. This involves that one solo champion doing pretty much all of the team's damage with everybody else supporting them. This was almost always done on the mid laner, and in Fnatic's case we do remember seeing Caps doing it on Kai'Sa, which made Reckless play stuff like Janna, which was definitely not his strongest champion. Since Reckless did have to play some really weird picks, he even ended up benching himself for Bwipo, who was a top lane sub of the team. This is because top lane champions were more effective in the bottom lane, so there was really no point for Reckless to even play down there anymore. So during this strategy, the mid laner would farm of course the mid lane and the jungle as well, with help from their quote unquote jungler to get as big as they could as quickly as possible. These junglers weren't really jungling anymore, they were more so supporting their mid laner. They'd be playing things like Nunu and Taric, which were not that entertaining to watch, and competitive games were really boring during this time period. I'm somebody personally that would watch almost every event, and I wouldn't really tune in too much during this time because it was really boring and it was almost pointless. Thankfully, this did end up changing eventually, and you were no longer able to funnel gold, and this strategy was no longer able to ruin both solo queue and competitive. Eventually, more AD carries found themselves back into the meta since Stormrazor was a pretty decent first item, although they weren't anywhere near where they were before patch 8.11. There are still, however, a lot of AD carries that are no longer playable. You pretty much have to be something that synergizes well with a Stormrazor, or you have to have some really solid defensives. The problems, however, did not end there. Riot decided to rework some champions, which is perfectly fine, but they overtuned the absolute shit out of them. First, there was the really tanky, high damage, and really hard to bring down Aatrox. There was the really mobile, incredibly strong teamfighter Aurelia. And then finally, there was the you can't even see me, but I can one-shot you whenever I want, Akali. These champions were insanely overtuned, and they were even referred to on Beyond the Rift by Voyboy as the Monstars from Space Jam. They laughed and joked about how insane these champions were, but they were completely right. These champions, like in this picture here, started off not too powerful. They were okay champions, but they weren't that popular in the meta, and then when Riot got a hold of them and did the rework, they turned into this. Completely overtuned, really tanky, and insane damage output. They did as much damage as AD carries, actually probably a lot more, and they were a lot tankier and had really solid defensives. Why even bother playing another champion when you can play one of these? Aatrox was already a champion becoming pretty popular in the meta before his rework, so I'm not really too sure why they even bothered doing it, but they did anyways. He's always been a champion that does some pretty high damage, and this remained, but he got increased tankiness and a lot of crowd control. His Q ability can pop up the enemy 3 different times, and his W can even pull back the enemy, while he also has some pretty decent mobility from his E. He's been a very popular pick ever since his rework, and he can be played in the top, mid, jungle, and even AD carry role. He was a very high priority pick throughout Worlds, and remains there in solo queue to this day. Aurelia was another champion that was very popular throughout Worlds, especially in the mid lane. She is a very mobile champion that can dish out a lot of damage and even has AoE crowd control. The best part of her kit, however, is her really strong teamfighting ultimate. Her ultimate deals some pretty decent damage, but also disarms and slows targets, so if she can hit multiple targets in a teamfight, it is incredibly strong. This really strong teamfighting ultimate, combined with her really high mobility and ridiculous damage, is why she was one of the most contested picks and remains there to this day. Akali was actually a champion that wasn't seen too much in Worlds, but that's only because it was so incredibly broken that nobody wouldn't ban it. Everybody remembers Bjergsen 1v9ing on this champion, and there's no way it would get through during Worlds. Akali has a lot of one-shot potential, a lot of mobility which is actually out of control, and a really solid stealth that makes her untargetable from towers as well. This makes it incredibly easy to tower dive on Akali. I'm not sure why the hell they thought this was a good idea, but it exists and it's incredibly broken. Even if AD carries did have their damage back, I don't know how they survived these champions anyways. They are kind of out of control and something should be done about it. There was some minor nerfs, but all of these gameplays are post-nerf anyways. Now, although there was a lot of negative shit to come out of Season 8, I would say that it was probably the best Worlds that's ever been done. Because of the changed meta, people no longer had to watch teams play a very Korean style and focus on macro for 40 plus minutes for finally something to happen. I remember seeing countless games in the past Worlds and other seasons where there would be just a handful of kills at the 30 minutes mark, which wasn't the best thing to watch. New champions were also played in Worlds that you haven't really seen before, which made it very entertaining. Of course, there was a meta or tier list that was formed, but you didn't always have to watch the same champion over and over again, although there was a lot of Urgot versus Aatrox in the top lane at the start. Games became a lot faster paced, and you saw a lot more action throughout the games, which made them end quicker than ever before. It was no longer painful to watch Worlds, it was very entertaining. This even led to all sorts of different upsets, and both teams from NA and EU made it farther than they have in many years. It was really nice for once to have faith in a team from your own region. NA was able to get behind C9, and of course EU was able to get behind Fnatic. It was no longer about waiting for your team to get crushed by a top tier Korean team. I would say, however, that this was kind of at the expense of solo queue because it felt like Riot overtuned some champions on purpose to make Worlds a lot more entertaining. Thank God it was though, because if Worlds wasn't entertaining, I would say the season would be a complete failure. There was also some pretty solid music, although not really my style, by KDA performing at the Worlds opening ceremony. It was pretty entertaining to watch right from the opening ceremony all the way to the end when IG won Worlds. For the most part, Season 8 was a letdown, but let's hope Season 9 is much better.